Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
I first noticed it with the coffee mug, such a small thing, really. Navy blue with a chip on the rim, my favorite despite its imperfection. Or maybe because of it. I always left it in the dish rack to dry overnight, but that morning it was in the cabinet, pristine and unchipped. "Did you wash my mug?" I asked Mark, who was absorbed in his phone at the kitchen table. He glanced up, brow furrowed. "What mug?" "My blue one, the chipped one." "Haven't seen it," he returned to scrolling. "Maybe you put it away yourself last night." I stood there staring at the perfect rim where the chip should have been. The early morning light caught the ceramic surface, making it gleam like a fresh bruise. Maybe I'd put it away. Maybe the chip had just been a smudge all along. But something about it felt wrong, like when you catch movement in your peripheral vision, only to turn and find empty space. That was the beginning. Small things at first. A book reshelved in the wrong spot. My keys on the counter when I swore I'd left them by the door. A text conversation with my sister that I had no memory of having. Each instance was easily explained away. I'd been distracted, I was tired. Memory is fallible, after all. But then the changes got bigger. "The paint looks nice," Mark commented one evening as we pulled into the driveway. "Good choice." I stared at our house, my stomach dropping. The shutters, once a forest green, were now a deep burgundy. I didn't paint them." Mark laughed. "Very funny. You were out there all last weekend. I helped you, remember? You were worried about getting paint on the brick. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I remembered last weekend perfectly. I'd spent it inside, working on a deadline for the magazine, while Mark was at his mother's. Hadn't he been at his mother's? "Are you feeling okay?" He reached over, touching my forehead. His hand was cool, familiar, but something about his concern felt performative, like an actor who had rehearsed the same scene too many times. "You've been a bit scattered lately." Had I? The more I thought about it, the more uncertain I became. There were gaps in my memory. Spaces where details should have been but weren't, like trying to recall a dream that dissolves faster the harder you chase it. I started keeping notes on my phone, documenting everything, what I wore each day, where I put things, conversations I had. I took photos of rooms before I left them, of items in their proper places. Mark caught me photographing the contents of our medicine cabinet one morning. "Inventory?" he asked, amused. "Planning to open a pharmacy?" "Just organizing," I said, trying to sound casual. I didn't tell him about the extra prescription bottle I'd found the day before. Lorazepam in my name, half empty, that I had no memory of being prescribed. The notes helped, until they didn't. I'd open my phone to find entries I didn't remember writing, describing events I didn't remember experiencing. Photos would be missing, replaced by others that showed rooms arranged differently than I recalled. One night, I found myself staring at a photo of Mark and me at his cousin's wedding. We were smiling, my head resting on his shoulder, his arm around my waist. The photo was dated 3 months ago. Mark didn't have a cousin. I'd never worn the dress I was wearing in the photo. The woman in the picture had my face, my smile, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked, like someone had taken features that should have been familiar and arranged them in a slightly different way. I deleted the photo, and the next morning it was back. I started sleeping less, watching more. I installed a security camera in our bedroom, only to find the footage corrupted each morning. Hours of static between midnight and dawn. The few clear frames showed me sleeping soundly, while shadows moved across the walls in patterns that didn't match the light from our windows. Mark grew increasingly concerned. He started scheduling doctor's appointments that I had no recollection of agreeing to. The doctors spoke in soft, careful tones about stress and memory issues and the benefits of medication. They all had the same look in their eyes, practiced sympathy, masking something else, something that made my skin crawl. I found myself questioning everything. Had that painting always hung in our hallway? Had the stairs always creaked in that particular spot? Had Mark's eyes always been that shade of brown? The breaking point came on a Tuesday, or maybe it was a Thursday. The days had started to blur together, time stretching and contracting like taffy pulled too thin. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when I noticed something odd about my reflection. My movements were perfectly synchronized, but something was off. I leaned closer to the mirror, studying my face. I smiled. My reflection smiled a fraction of a second too late. I raised my hand to touch the glass. My reflection didn't move at all. It just stood there, watching me with my own eyes, head tilted slightly, as if considering something. Then it smiled again, a wide, terrible smile that stretched too far across its face. I ran from the bathroom, heart pounding. When I returned an hour later, armed with Mark's baseball bat, the mirror was normal again. But there was a handprint on the glass, on the other side, with fingers just slightly too long to be human. That night, I lay awake, listening to Mark breathing beside me. In, out, in, out. Perfect and steady, like a metronome. Too perfect. I turned to look at him. In the darkness, his back was to me, shoulders rising and falling in that same mechanical rhythm. "Mark?" I whispered. The breathing stopped. He turned slowly, like a door swinging on rusted hinges. In the dim light from the window, his face was wrong, features fluid and uncertain, as if they couldn't quite decide where to settle. "Yes, dear?" he said with my voice. I ran to the house that was no longer my house, past photos on the walls that showed memories I'd never lived out, into the night that felt more real than anything inside had for weeks. I drove until I ran out of gas, ending up at a 24-hour diner off the highway. The neon lights were harsh but honest, throwing everything into sharp relief. No shadows to hide in, no spaces for reality to blur. I took out my phone, hands shaking, and opened my notes. The screen was filled with entries I didn't remember writing, all in my handwriting, but not quite right, like someone had studied my style and made a close but imperfect copy. The last entry was from today, time-stamped 1 minute ago. You can't run from yourself. We're already here. We've always been here, in the space between your memories. Turn around. I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to. But I felt my head turning anyway, muscles moving to commands I hadn't given. The diner window reflected my face, smiling that wrong smile. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I was back in my bed. Mark was sleeping beside me, breathing steady and sure. The shutters outside were forest green again. My chipped mug was in the dish rack. Everything was back to normal. I almost believed it until I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the bedroom mirror. It winked at me, raised a finger to its lips, and turned away while I stayed perfectly still. Sometimes I see it watching me from mirrors and windows, wearing my face like an ill-fitting mask. Sometimes I catch Mark staring at me with eyes that don't quite focus, like he's looking through me to something else. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still in that diner, or if I ever left my bathroom that Tuesday or Thursday, or whatever day it was, when I first noticed my reflection hadn't quite kept up with me. The doctors say I'm getting better. They've adjusted my medication I don't remember being prescribed, in bottles that appear and disappear. From my cabinet like cats in the dark, Mark is supportive, loving. He holds me when I wake up screaming, whispers that everything will be okay. His touch feels almost real now. Almost. Last night I found a new note on my phone, a single line in my handwriting, but not mine. We're still deciding which version of you to keep. I've stopped looking in mirrors. I've stopped taking photos. I've stopped trying to track the changes. It's easier this way, living in the spaces between memories, pretending not to notice when reality shifts like sand under my feet. But sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I hear breathing that doesn't quite match the rise and fall of my chest, and I wonder, am I the original, or just another copy learning to perform the role of myself? I don't think I want to know the answer. The coffee mug is in the cabinet now, perfect and unchipped. I leave it there. Some things are better left unquestioned. After all, memory is fallible, isn't it? The first unusual thing I noticed that autumn was how the temple's red paper lanterns stopped swaying in the wind. They hung perfectly still, even when cool breezes rustled the maple leaves in the courtyard. I mentioned this to my father one evening as he practiced his erhu, but he only nodded absently, his fingers moving across the strings with the practiced grace of a man whose family had been temple musicians for 3 generations. Father believed that nothing, not poverty, not illness, not even strange omens, should interrupt the music. Our life had settled into familiar patterns, Father playing his erhu while Mother sewed costumes, and Aunt Grace arranged flowers for the altar. Cousin Martin copied scripts in his careful calligraphy. We lived in the small houses clustered around the Lotus Temple, where the sweet smoke of incense mingled with the smell of Mother's cooking and the mustiness of old texts. The temple's walls were our world, and we measured time by the rhythm of ceremonies and performances rather than calendar dates. That autumn, Mr. Harrison began visiting more frequently. He would arrive in his expensive car, speaking loudly about the money he'd lent Father while his eyes followed me around the courtyard. Sometimes he would bring small gifts, oranges or mooncakes, which Mother accepted with tight-lipped smiles. After each visit, Father would disappear into his study with his ledger, and the sound of his erhu would carry a mournful tone late into the night. I had a boyfriend then, Thomas Wu, an architect with careful hands and ambitious plans. He spoke of San Francisco, of modern buildings and opportunities, while I nodded and pretended I could leave the temple's embrace. We both knew his parents disapproved of me, of my family's reputation as traditional opera performers who barely made ends meet. Still, in those early autumn days, I could pretend that love might be enough. The old woman first appeared during the Mid-Autumn Festival. I was helping Aunt Grace arrange chrysanthemums when I noticed her watching me from beneath the unnaturally still lanterns. She wore a black cheongsam that seemed to absorb the evening light, and her face had the smooth, ageless quality of a porcelain mask. Something about her stillness reminded me of the lanterns. "Linda Chin," she said, though I hadn't told her my name. "Born in the year of the water rooster, were you not?" I nodded, feeling Aunt Grace's hand tighten on my arm. "I am Madame Wei," she continued, her voice like silk sliding over stone. "I help arrange special marriages." She visited 3 more times before she mentioned the ghost marriage. Each time she would appear at sunset, bearing small gifts, lotus seeds, red paper cuts, stories of the wealthy Zhao family and their departed son, Michael. She spoke of him as if he were merely traveling, as if death were simply another province where young men went to seek their fortunes. The bracelet appeared on her 4th visit. Jade and gold, it caught the light in ways that made my eyes hurt if I looked too long. A family heirloom, she called it, though she never specified which family. Wear it until the ceremony, and all your family's debts will be cleared. I didn't accept it that day, or the next, but I would find myself thinking about it during quiet moments, while washing dishes or helping Mother with her sewing, or listening to Mr. Harrison's increasingly pointed comments about debt collection. The weight of our poverty pressed down like the autumn mists that had begun to gather in the temple courtyard, thick and suffocating. Thomas noticed the change in me. "You seem distant," he said one evening as we walked beneath the maple trees. Their leaves had turned the color of dried blood. "Is it about my parents? The engagement they're arranging?" I hadn't known about the engagement. The hurt must have shown on my face because he reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Behind him, I thought I saw a figure in black watching from the shadows, but when I looked again, there was only mist. That night, I dreamed of jade corridors and whispered Cantonese, though I spoke none. I woke to find my window open, though I'd closed it, and the scent of ancient incense hanging in the air. The next morning, Madame Wei was waiting in the courtyard with the bracelet. I took it. The changes were subtle at first. The temple's cats began avoiding me. The incense smoke seemed to follow me, curling around my feet like affectionate serpents. I would catch glimpses of women in ancient dress at the corners of my vision, their feet never quite touching the ground. But these were small things, easily dismissed in the daily routine of temple life. Then Mr. Harrison died. They found him in his study, the windows and doors locked from inside, his chest carved open with surgical precision. The police blamed animals, though no one could explain how an animal could lock doors behind itself. I dreamed of him that night, saw him running through endless dark corridors, while shadows with burning eyes pursued him. When I woke, the bracelet felt heavier. Thomas's death came 3 weeks later. We argued outside the temple about his engagement, about obligations and families, and futures we could never have. I watched something move beneath his skin, like shadows under ice. I watched his eyes turn white as milk, watched him try to scream, but no sound came out. By morning, he was gone, and the whispers in Cantonese had grown louder. Aunt Grace was the first to recognize the bracelet's design from an old scroll in the temple library. She worked through 3 nights translating the ancient text, her hands shaking as she showed me the drawings of the fourth court of Du, the Chinese hell where souls are collected and judged. Michael Zhao was no ordinary spirit, she explained, her voice barely a whisper. He was a soul collector, and his 4 previous brides still serve him in death. The marriage isn't a ceremony, it's a harvesting. I should have removed the bracelet then, should have thrown it into the temple's sacred fire, or buried it in consecrated ground. But when I tried, my fingers wouldn't obey. The jade seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the whispers promised peace, prosperity, an end to all our family's troubles. Master Lu, the temple's eldest monk, began researching ghost marriages when Aunt Grace brought her concerns to him. Through his connections, we met Daniel Wong, a computer programmer who had been tracking similar cases. His apartment was filled with computers displaying police reports alongside ancient texts. Missing person posters of 5 women who shared my birth year. They all disappeared after meeting Madame Wei. The spirit needs a living bride to cross over, to take your place among the living while trapping you in Du. We planned the exorcism carefully, but we didn't understand then that time moves differently for the dead. They took my father first during a ritual opera performance meant to protect us. One moment he was playing his erhu, the next he was gone, leaving only the lingering note of a broken string. I had to follow. The gates to Du opened like a wound in reality, and I stepped through willingly, the bracelet growing warm against my skin. The fourth court was everything the scrolls described and worse. The lake of blood and fire stretched endlessly, its surface broken by the faces of the damned. I saw Thomas there, and Mr. Harrison, their souls twisted by torment. The 4 bride spirits pursued me through temples made of bone and bridges of human hair, their laughter echoing like breaking glass. Madame Wei appeared too, her true form revealed. Not a matchmaker, but a vessel, another trapped soul serving the collector. Her warnings came too late. He cannot be stopped. He has waited centuries for a bride like you. But she was wrong. In the end, it wasn't ancient magic or sacred rituals that saved us. It was something simpler. My father's love, breaking through even the barriers of death, and the realization that the bracelet's power worked both ways. As it bound me to the spirit realm, it also bound the spirits to it. When I destroyed the bracelet, the effects rippled through both worlds. We escaped through the gateway as the fourth court collapsed, taking Michael Zhao and his bride's spirits with it. Father and I awoke in the temple, surrounded by burning incense and concerned faces. We burned every painting, photograph, and possession of the Zhao family we could find. The temple now holds regular exorcisms just to be safe. Daniel still searches for records of other ghost marriages, other women who might be in danger. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is dark, I catch a glimpse of something in mirrors or windows, a face that's almost mine, but not quite. And I wonder if we truly escaped, or if somewhere in the spaces between worlds, Michael Zhao is still waiting, still collecting, still searching for his perfect bride. I keep the jade pieces of the broken bracelet in a blessed box, sealed with prayers and salt, not as a reminder I could never forget, but as a warning. Because sometimes on very still nights, I can hear them whispering. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself wanting to answer. They say a ghost marriage binds 2 souls for eternity. They never mention which eternity, the bride's or the ghost's. Our town had always been quiet, almost preternaturally so, as my London friends often remarked when visiting. The streets wound between ancient oaks whose branches seemed to catch and muffle sound, and even the usual bustling noises of commerce along Main Street felt somehow subdued, as if heard through layers of velvet. I had grown used to this peculiar quality during my 15 years as resident historian and librarian, even finding comfort in it. Now I understand that the quiet was merely a prelude, a whispered warning of what was to come. I first noticed something truly amiss on an unseasonably warm afternoon in late September, the kind of day that usually brought children out in droves, their voices carrying across carefully manicured lawns and through open windows. I was in my garden, as I often was, tending to the herbs I grew for Mrs. Harrison, the doctor's wife. She believed in the medicinal properties of fresh thyme and rosemary, a notion I privately found charmingly antiquated. The garden afforded me a clear view of old Mrs. Pembroke's Victorian mansion at number 7 Sycamore Street. The house had always possessed a certain brooding quality, its gables and turrets seeming to loom larger than architecture alone could account for. Mrs. Pembroke herself was a fixture of local life, though not a particularly beloved one. Her dedication to her roses was matched only by her vitriolic defense of them against real or imagined threats, particularly the neighborhood children. That afternoon, I watched young Timothy Chin and his friends playing with a ball near her prized flower beds. Their game had been going on for perhaps 20 minutes when Mrs. Pembroke emerged from her front door like an avenging spirit, her gray hair askew and her face flushed with familiar rage. I sighed, setting down my gardening shears and preparing to intervene, as I often did in these situations. But something was different this time. Mrs. Pembroke's mouth opened. I could see the working of her jaw, the tension in her neck, but no sound emerged. Not the usual shriek of, "You horrible little vandals," or, "I'll call your parents." Just nothing. The silence was absolute and somehow wrong in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The children noticed too. They stopped their game, staring at Mrs. Pembroke with the unfiltered curiosity of the young. She clutched at her throat, her eyes widening with dawning horror. Our gazes met across the carefully tended hydrangeas that separated our properties, and in that moment, I saw something in her expression that I would soon become terribly familiar with. The realization that something fundamental had been stolen, something we all took for granted until its absence became a screaming void. Mrs. Pembroke fled inside, the door closing behind her with what should have been a bang, but produced only a dull thud, as if the very air around her home had thickened, becoming resistant to sound itself. The children resumed their game, but their laughter seemed muted now, uncertain. I told myself it was nothing, laryngitis perhaps, or some other temporary affliction. But that evening, as I sat in my study reviewing town records, I was researching a monograph on local architectural history. I found myself unable to concentrate. The silence from next door pressed against my windows like a physical thing. Normally, at this hour, I would hear Mrs. Pembroke moving about, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, the occasional clink of china as she prepared her evening tea. Now there was nothing. I almost went to check on her. Later, I would wish fervently that I had. Instead, I immersed myself in my work, a seemingly innocent decision, that would lead me down a path of discovery I now wish desperately I could unknow. The next few days passed without incident, though Mrs. Pembroke didn't emerge from her house. I assumed she had called her daughter in Boston, Margaret I believed her name was, and was receiving proper medical care. It wasn't until I encountered Dr. Harrison at the grocery store that I learned she hadn't sought treatment at all. "Most peculiar case," he said, frowning at a display of apples as if they might hold answers. "Complete aphonia, loss of voice, but with no apparent physical cause. And she's not the only one. Had 3 more cases just like it yesterday, all within a few blocks of Sycamore Street. It must be some sort of virus, though I've never seen anything quite like it. The CDC is sending someone next week to investigate." They never arrived. By then, the silence had spread too far. It moved like frost across a window pane, house by house, street by street. The pattern was so precise, it might have been drawn with a compass, radiating outward from number 7 Sycamore Street. Within a week, dozens were afflicted. Within 2, hundreds. The hospital was overwhelmed, though no treatment seemed to help. Every test came back normal, even as more and more people lost their voices. The national news picked up the story briefly, dubbing it the quietus, before more sensational headlines pushed us from the spotlight. Local reporting continued longer, until the day Beth Chen, our town's most tenacious journalist, opened her mouth during a live broadcast and found herself unable to speak. It might have remained merely tragic, a medical mystery, a local catastrophe, if not for the dreams. They started slowly, subtly. Those who had lost their voices began walking at night, gathering in groups on the street corners or in parks. At first, people assumed they were seeking comfort in shared affliction, but there was something wrong about their movements, something mechanical and purposeful that spoke of coordination beyond mere coincidence. I began spending my evenings in the town archives, driven by an inexplicable certainty that the past held answers. The basement room had always been my sanctuary, its tall shelves of leather-bound volumes and yellowing papers offering the comfort of academic pursuit. But now the silence seemed to pool there like water, growing deeper with each passing day. It was there, by the flickering fluorescent lights, that I found the first clue, a trial transcript from 1847, crumbling and water-stained, but still legible. The case of Eleanor Thayer, accused of witchcraft in an era when such charges had largely fallen out of fashion. The details were sparse, but one thing stood out. The primary accusation came from children who claimed she had stolen their voices while they slept. The coincidence might have ended there, if not for the address listed as her place of residence, the plot of land where number 7 Sycamore Street now stood. I spent the next several nights piecing together Eleanor Thayer's story from fragments scattered throughout the archives. She was a widow who lived alone, keeping to herself except for weekly visits to the market. The children's accusations were joined by adult witnesses who claimed to have seen her walking at night, conducting silent conversations with invisible beings. During her trial, she never spoke a word in her own defense, but witnesses reported seeing her smile throughout the proceedings, as if privy to some private joke. She was hanged on a Sunday morning, and according to the court records, her last action was to open her mouth in what appeared to be silent laughter, the same expression I had seen on Mrs. Pembroke's face when she first lost her voice. The connection nagged at me, drawing me deeper into research even as the town around me fell further into its unnatural quiet. I discovered that Mrs. Pembroke was the 7th owner of the house since Eleanor Thayer's death. She had moved in on July 7th and lost her voice at precisely 7:07 p.m. I had checked my garden journal where I meticulously recorded daily events, but it was the daguerreotype that truly made my blood run cold. I found it quite by accident, hidden behind a loose brick in Mrs. Pembroke's cellar wall. I had broken in, I freely admit, this transgression, driven by an almost manic need to understand. The image showed Eleanor Thayer standing proud despite her chains, and her face was Mrs. Pembroke's face. Not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly the same, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow. On the back of the daguerreotype, in faded brown ink, was written, "The silence will return with the 7th, and what was stolen will be reclaimed." I sit now in my basement study, writing this account by candlelight because the power failed 2 days ago. The silence has become almost complete. Even those who can still speak find their voices muted, as if the air itself is reluctant to carry sound. The birds have gone, and the insects, and even the wind seems to move without whisper or sigh. But worse than the silence is what I'm beginning to hear in its absence. In the perfect quiet of night, when even my heartbeat seems distant and strange, there's something else, a sort of anti-sound, a negative space where noise should be, forming patterns that my mind interprets as words. Eleanor Thayer is speaking to us through the silence she's created and what she's saying. I understand now why they walk the streets at night, their mouths open in silent screams. They're trying to drown out her words with their non-existent voices. They're trying to unhear the things she's telling them, the promises, the revelations, the truths that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. My own voice began fading yesterday. It started with the higher frequencies. I could no longer whistle or pronounce certain sibilant sounds. Now even my lowest tones are barely audible. Soon I'll join the ranks of the silent ones, walking the streets of our damned town, conducting mute conversations with the dead. But before that happens, I need to write down one last thing, a warning to anyone who might find this account. If you're reading these words, stay away from our town. Don't try to help us. Don't try to break the silence, because silence isn't merely the absence of sound. It's the presence of something else, something that has been waiting centuries to be heard. And once you hear it, once you truly understand the message hidden in the silence, the rest of the manuscript appears to be blank, though there are several pages of paper that show signs of frantic writing, but no visible text remains. The only mark is a single word scrolled in the bottom corner of the last page. Listen. I first noticed something was wrong with Julie during breakfast. She was sitting across from me, stirring her coffee with mechanical precision, when I realized I couldn't quite remember what she looked like. Not in the way you sometimes forget a detail about someone you've known forever. This was different, more immediate, more wrong. "Julie," I said, and she looked up at me with what should have been her face, but wasn't, where features should have been, the green eyes I'd fallen in love with, the small scar above her lip from a childhood accident, the constellation of freckles across her nose. There was only smooth, blank flesh, like unworked clay. I screamed. The sound tore through our kitchen, bouncing off the yellow wall she'd insisted on painting herself last spring. The thing wearing my wife's body didn't flinch. It just kept stirring the coffee, round and round and round. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, I understand that I was lucky. Lucky to have seen it happen. Lucky to have witnessed the change. Most people just forget. Their loved ones become strangers, then nothing at all, as if they never existed. Family photos develop mysterious blurs. Social media accounts vanish. Birth certificates turn to blank pages. The world reorganizes itself around the absence, like water flowing around a stone. But I remember. God help me, I remember everything. They're calling it facial deliquescence on the news, when they bother to report on it at all. The headlines grow smaller each day, as if the very idea of the condition is somehow slipping from collective consciousness. The official estimate is that 1 in every 10,000 people has been affected, but I think it's more. I've started keeping count of the blank faces I see on my morning commute to the architecture firm. Yesterday, I spotted about 3 on the subway alone. The worst part isn't seeing them. It's watching other people not see them. The way their eyes slide past the smooth, featureless faces like water off glass. The way they make space unconsciously in crowds, never quite acknowledging why they're stepping aside. We're becoming trained to ignore the impossible, and that terrifies me more than the impossibility itself. I've started carrying Julie's photograph everywhere I go. Not a digital copy, those are too easily erased, but a physical print, one I had made years ago at a real dark room. It's already starting to fade around the edges, her features becoming less distinct with each passing day. Sometimes I take it out just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy, that she existed, that the woman who now moves through our house like a gentle ghost once had a face that could smile and laugh and cry. Last night I caught her studying herself in a bathroom mirror, running fingertips over the smooth expanse where her face should be. The gesture was so familiar. She used to do the same thing while applying her moisturizer before bed, that for a moment I almost forgot to be afraid. "Can you still see?" I asked from the doorway. It was the first time I'd spoken to her directly since the change. She turned toward me, and I felt the weight of her attention despite the absence of eyes. "Better than before," she said in Julie's voice. "I see everything now. I've started noticing patterns. The faceless ones gather in places of transition, subway stations, airport terminals, hospital waiting rooms. They watch, patient and still, as people rush past. Hunting, I think, though I've never seen them take a face. Not yet. Dr. Chen at the CDC reached out to me after I posted about Julie online. She's one of the few researchers still actively studying the phenomenon, though she admitted that funding is drying up, interest waning, as if the very concept is somehow repellent to human consciousness. "The mind wants to look away," she told me over video chat, her own face pixelating occasionally in a way that made my heart race. It's like trying to hold on to a dream after waking. The harder you try to focus on it, the more it slips away. She's documented 327 cases so far. Of those, only 8 witnesses remember seeing the actual transition. I'm the only one still living with a faceless one. The others all disappeared shortly after reporting their experiences. Dr. Chen doesn't use the word disappeared. She says they became unavailable for follow-up, but I can read between the lines. "Why do you stay?" she asked me near the end of our call. "Aren't you afraid?" "I am. God, I am. But I'm more afraid of forgetting. Someone has to remember Julie as she was. Someone has to keep count. Besides, I've started to wonder if it matters whether I stay or go. Last week I saw another faceless one on my street, standing perfectly still beneath a flickering streetlight. It wore a familiar blue pea coat, the same one my brother David bought last winter. I haven't been able to reach him since. The thing that used to be Julie is getting bolder. This morning I found her sitting on our bed, holding our wedding album. The photos inside were all wrong. In every image, her face was already smooth and blank, as if she'd always been this way. But there was one photo that scared me more than the others. Our first dance as husband and wife. In it, my own face was beginning to blur. "It doesn't have to hurt," she said without looking up. Julie's voice, but flat now, like a recording played underwater. "When it happens, when you let me take it, it can be gentle. Like falling asleep." I ran, grabbed my keys, my wallet, the photograph I carry everywhere. But I stopped at the front door, my hand on the knob, and realized I couldn't remember what David looked like anymore, or my mother, or my best friend from college. Their faces had become smudges in my memory, like fingerprints on glass. How many faces has Julie taken? How many lives has she erased while I slept in the next room? And why can't I still remember her when everyone else seems to have forgotten? The answer came to me yesterday as I watched her watching our neighbors through the living room window. She's saving me for last, keeping me as a witness, a repository of memory, until she's ready. Until she's collected enough faces to fill the void where hers used to be. I'm writing this now because I know what I have to do. The gun in my bedside drawer won't work. I tried it 3 days ago, but the bullets passed through her as if she were made of smoke. You can't kill something that doesn't fully exist, but maybe you can starve it. Tomorrow, I'm going to the basement of the CDC building where Dr. Chen keeps her physical records. Every photograph, every written statement, every piece of evidence that these things exist. I'm going to destroy all of it. Then I'm going to burn this journal, delete every email, every text message, every digital breadcrumb that might lead someone else to the truth. Finally, I'm going to let Julie take my face. Not because I've given up, but because I've figured it out. They feed on remembering. Every person who notices them, who acknowledges their existence, who carries the memory of what was lost. We are keeping them alive. The only way to stop them is to let ourselves forget. So, if you're reading this, if somehow this record survived what I'm about to do, I beg you, look away, delete this file, burn this page, forget you ever saw it. And if you notice someone on the street whose face seems slightly wrong, or if you wake up one morning unable to quite remember what your loved ones look like, don't try to hold on to the memory. Let it slip away. It's the only way to save them. Story 10. I remember when the nightmares first started. I think it was 10, maybe 12 years ago. We had just gotten a new house, one of those old buildings that cracked and groaned when anything moved inside it. The ones they sell real cheap to poor families like mine, instead of demolishing. I was only 16 at the time, and my dad thought that he, my brother, and I could use a rest start away from the city. Sometimes I wish we never started. I wish we never moved out of our old apartment. But sometimes I understand that maybe it was fate that brought me here. Fate that dragged me to the front steps of a nightmare. I remember that first night that the man appeared, tall and pale. I saw him immediately and tried to move, tried to scream, but I was frozen, stuck in the bed as he stood just in the corner of the door frame, his face devoid of features except for the two black pits that made his eyes as he watched me. I, of course, knew what was happening the moment I realized that I couldn't move. I was experiencing sleep paralysis. I knew that I had gotten it a couple of times before, but in those times, I never really saw anything. And while I knew it was possible, I didn't really ever expect to actually see something watching me. I told my dad about it the next day, and he said I was probably tired and stressed after the move, and just too worried about never seeing my friends again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But he was my dad, so I knew to listen to him. And I told myself that maybe it was really just stress. And then the second night came around, and there I was yet again, frozen in place. This time, however, there was nothing in the door frame. The room felt almost empty as I turned my eyes to my left, until suddenly I began to feel panic. I could hear something above me, just out of sight, a weak, guttural groaning, as I fearfully turned my eyes to the ceiling and saw the source of the horrible sound. It was a woman in a white dress, her hair twisted and matted, and her skin pale enough to see every black vein through her stretched skin, and her eyes were sunken deep into the sockets. Her jaw opened impossibly wide as she gasped and groaned, reaching a bony finger to point at me as bugs and worms fell from her body and onto my face. And then it was morning. The third night was the one that made us move again, the night that I remember most, and probably why I remember the other nights as well as I did. I was able to move this time, but the man was still there, his pale face still skinless and featureless, save for the deep holes in his face that gazed at me. I watched in horror as he pointed at me, slowly stepping from the doorway and showing me the horror that stood in front of me. He was wearing a monkey suit and a set of black shoes, the kind that people nowadays would pay thousands for. As he moved, frail step after frail step, I suddenly heard the groaning and hesitantly turned my head to the ceiling, watching as the woman yet again pulled herself out from the dusty surface, her bones now cracking and groaning as she crawled out, reaching for me. I could feel every part of my mind rushing by. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I began to sob, releasing a weak, "What do you want from me?" from my dried lips. To my surprise, the pair stopped, turning their heads towards me, before suddenly the man began to claw at his sealed mouth, ripping off the skin that covered his teeth in a display of gore that burned into my mind. Slowly, he began to speak, raspy and dry, his voice as tired and dead as he was. I could see his chest rise and fall throughout every word. "We want freedom." I was taken aback, hesitantly asking another question. Freedom from what? And now the woman spoke, her voice soft and raspy, and occasionally interrupted by the horrid sound of her gagging as worms and flies forced their way out of her throat. Freedom. From this house. Freedom to rest. All of us. All of us. "How many of you are there?" I stuttered. And then the hands came, tearing out of the ceiling and walls like bullets, each one tearing away at wood, fiberglass, and plaster to reveal thousands of rotting, groaning faces. Skulls and sockets stared at me as 1,000 voices screamed in unison, screaming out their answer. Hundreds, hundreds. Suddenly, everything disappeared. All of the faces, the man, and the woman. And I snapped awake, my dad shaking me as I screamed uncontrollably. That was what made my dad call the police, and after a few minutes of searching, they found the bodies. It was horrifying. Apparently, one of them saw something gleaming from a small hole in the wall and took a hammer to it. In total, there were exactly 231 bodies found inside of the house, each one having gone missing nearly 50 years ago, some even longer. However, the thing I find the most disturbing was the last 2 sets of corpses, nearly 60 years old. They were a couple, still in their tattered and dusty marriage clothes. The police said that when they found them, there were scratches and tears. On the wall they were trapped inside of, their clawing, desperate hands still weakly stuck into the plaster, pointing with their cold, ground-down nails. They were found right behind my bedroom wall. In the closing years of the Edo period, when the black ships of Commodore Perry had begun to cast long shadows across Japan's shores, and the old order trembled like autumn leaves in the wind, there lived in Kyoto a young samurai named Matsuda Shinji. Born to a respected but modest branch of the Matsuda clan, he had earned his position in the household of Hosokawa Yoshikuni, not through hereditary right, but through demonstrable skill with the blade. Though only 23 years of age, he had already distinguished himself during the recent peasant uprisings in Tamba province, where his keen eye and swift sword had saved his lord from an assassin's arrow. Yet Shinji carried within him a deeper understanding of the supernatural world than most of his fellow samurai. His grandmother had been a miko at the ancient Kizu Daira temple, and from her he had learned the old ways, how to recognize the signs of yokai, the proper prayers to ward off evil spirits, and most importantly, the knowledge that not all monsters wore hideous faces. On this particular autumn evening, the 13th day of the 9th month by the old calendar, Shinji was returning from his duties through the narrow streets of the Gion district. He had spent the day accompanying his lord to meetings with foreign merchants, and his mind was troubled by the changes he saw coming to his beloved city. The paper lanterns swayed in the chill breeze, casting elongated shadows across the wooden buildings, their warm light failing to penetrate the deeper darkness of the alleyways. The air hung heavy with the scent of burning incense from nearby temples, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, and a lingering smoke from the cooking fires of countless households. The hour of the pig had just begun, and the entertainment district was coming alive with the sound of shamisen music, drifting from the tea houses and the quiet laughter of geiko hurrying to their appointments. The moon had hidden her face behind thick clouds, and there was an unseasonable chill in the air that made Shinji pull his haori closer around his shoulders. As he passed the corner where the narrow Shirakawa stream crossed beneath the street, the sound of weeping drew his attention. There, beneath the eaves of the Ichiriki Ochaya, the most exclusive tea house in all of Gion, stood a woman of such extraordinary beauty that Shinji felt his breath catch in his throat. Her kimono was of the finest Nishijin silk, patterned with golden threads that seemed to move of their own accord in the lamplight. The design depicted orb weaver spiders spinning webs among chrysanthemum flowers, but the artistry was so fine that the insects seemed almost alive. Her face was pale as moonlight, framed by hair black as a raven's wing that fell well past her waist, arranged in the elaborate Shimada Maj style, favored by married women of the highest rank. Yet it was her eyes that captured him. They seemed to hold within them all the mysteries of the night sky, deep and dark and glittering with unknown stars. "Kind sir," she called to him, her voice like the gentle ringing of temple bells at twilight. "Would you help a woman in distress? I am the wife of a silk merchant from Nishijin, and I have lost my way in these unfamiliar streets. These times are troubled, and these streets are not safe for one alone." Shinji felt himself taking a step forward before his grandmother's training asserted itself. There was something in the way she held herself, too still, too perfect, that set off warnings in his mind. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "The most dangerous yokai are those that appear most beautiful to mortal eyes. Remember, grandson, that the Jorogumo always appears as a beautiful woman to ensnare her prey. Look for the signs, the pattern of her kimono, the unusual stillness, and above all, the eyes that never blink." He studied her more carefully now, noting how the shadows around her feet seemed to move against the light, how her kimono pattern rippled like living things. But it was when she smiled that he saw it. The briefest flash of something inhuman in her teeth, too sharp and numerous to belong to any mortal woman. And true to his grandmother's warning, he realized she had not blinked once since he first saw her. Without hesitation, Shinji's hand flew to his katana, a blade forged by the master swordsmith Kunihira 3 generations ago. The steel sang as it left its saya, catching the lamplight like liquid silver. The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes, her eyes, transformed, becoming black and multifaceted, like those of an insect. She moved with impossible speed, but Shinji had not earned his position through luck alone. His blade was faster still, drawing a line of scarlet across her midsection that would have disemboweled a mortal woman. A shriek split the night air, high and inhuman, as the creature that wore a woman's form leaped backward into the shadows. Where her blood fell, it hissed against the stone pavement, leaving small pockmarks in the rock that glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. Shinji pursued, following the trail of luminescent droplets that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, each one sizzling softly in the darkness. The trail led him away from the populated streets, past the Osaka shrine, and deep into the old quarter, where abandoned houses slouched against one another like drunken revelers. This was a part of Kyoto that had never recovered from the Great Fire 60 years earlier, where the wealthy merchants and artisans had abandoned their homes rather than rebuild in what they now considered an unlucky district. The droplets led to a particularly decrepit structure, its roof sagging and its walls black with decades of neglect. The entrance stood open, like a hungry mouth, and from within came a sound that made Shinji's skin crawl, a dry scratching, as of many legs moving across wooden floors, accompanied by a soft clicking that reminded him of chopsticks being struck together. Drawing upon every ounce of his courage and the protection of the Omamori charm his grandmother had given him, Shinji entered the darkness. The interior reeked of decay and something else, a sweet, cloying smell that reminded him of rotting fruit and the fermented silkworm cocoons used in the silk-making process. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he began to make out shapes suspended from the ceiling and walls. At first, he took them for bundles of cloth or abandoned furniture wrapped in dusty sheets. Then one of them moved, ever so slightly, and he realized with horror what he was seeing. Bodies. Dozens of them, cocooned in thick, silvery spider silk. Some were fresh, their wrappings still white and gleaming, and he could make out the features of faces he recognized, merchants and craftsmen who had recently been reported missing. Others had clearly hung there for months or even years, the silk yellowed and brittle with age. And most terrifying of all, some of the cocoons still moved, their occupants not yet dead, but trapped in a living nightmare, their struggles growing weaker with each passing moment as the spider's venom slowly digested them from within. A movement in the corner drew his attention. There, emerging from the shadows, came the true form of the creature he had wounded. It was massive, its body easily the size of a horse, with legs that stretched out longer than Shinji was tall. Its abdomen was swollen and marked with the same golden patterns he had seen on the kimono, but now they pulsed with a sickly light that cast strange shadows on the walls. The face was the worst. It still held traces of the beautiful woman's features, but they were distorted and wrong, merged with the mandibles and eyes of a giant Jorogumo spider. The multiple eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human, and when it spoke, its voice still held echoes of its earlier beauty, though now underlaid with a chittering whisper that made Shinji's bones ache. "Foolish samurai," it spoke, venom dripping from its fangs. "You should have accepted my invitation. It would have been quick, painless. Now, I shall take my time with you, and you shall hang in my collection until your bones turn to dust. Perhaps I shall keep you conscious longer than the others, so you may watch as I feed upon your essence, drop by drop." But the creature was wounded, its movement sluggish from the cut Shinji had inflicted. The blessed steel of his ancestral blade had done more damage than mere weapons should, and where the cut had landed, the monster's flesh seemed to be slowly dissolving, releasing a foul-smelling ichor that dripped onto the rotting tatami mats. As it plunged forward, Shinji rolled beneath its reaching legs, his years of martial training taking over as he thrust his blade upward into its bloated abdomen. The monster's shriek this time was deafening, and a flood of viscous fluid poured from the wound, burning where it touched Shinji's skin and eating through his clothing like acid. The battle that followed was brief but terrible. The Yorogumo fought with the desperation of a cornered beast, spinning webs of steel-strong silk and striking with poison fangs that could pierce armor. But Shinji's blade, perhaps guided by the spirits of his ancestors or blessed by his grandmother's prayers, found its mark again and again. Each wound seemed to weaken the creature more than it should have, as if the very steel of his sword was anathema to its supernatural flesh. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but could only have been minutes, the creature collapsed, its legs curling inward like a dying spider's. As its last breath rattled out, the monster's form shifted one final time, becoming once more the beautiful woman who had first caught his eye. But now the illusion held no power over him, and he watched dispassionately as both forms faded away, leaving only a massive spider's corpse that slowly dissolved into a pool of luminescent ichor that ate into the wooden floor beneath it. Shinji spent the remainder of the night cutting down the cocoons. Though he found only 3 victims still alive, a silk merchant from Nishijin, A young apprentice carpenter, and most surprisingly, a Dutch trader who had been missing for over a week. The others had been dead for weeks or months, their bodies preserved by the supernatural properties of the spider's silk, their faces frozen in expressions of terror that Shinji knew would haunt his dreams for years to come. When dawn finally broke, he led the survivors out into the light and reported the incident to his lord. The house was burned to the ground that very day, and salt was sown in the earth where it had stood. Buddhist priests from 3 different temples were brought in to perform purification rites, and the neighborhood was blessed by Shinto priests from the Osaka shrine. But for years afterward, women of uncommon beauty would sometimes be seen in the Gion district on moonless nights, weeping softly and asking strangers for help finding their way home. And if you walk those streets today, in the hours when the moon hides her face and the old magic still holds sway, you might still see traces of silvery thread catching the lamplight, or hear the soft scratching of many legs moving in the darkness above your head. Some say Shinji's blade, which he named Kumo Kiri Maru, or Spider Cutter, still exists, passed down through the generations of his family. They say the steel was transformed by the Jorogumo's blood, and that it glows with a soft blue light whenever yokai are near. The blade, they whisper, absorbed some of the spider's power that night, and those who have seen it swear that in certain lights, golden patterns like those on a spider's back can be seen shifting beneath its surface. But perhaps most troubling are the reports that still surface from time to time in Kyoto's Gion district. Stories of beautiful women in exquisitely patterned kimonos asking for directions on moonless nights. They say these women never blink, and the kimono always bears the pattern of spiders among the chrysanthemums. And they say that those who follow them are never seen again, though sometimes on very quiet nights, their screams can be heard echoing from the darkest corners of the old quarter, where the modern electric lights never quite seem to penetrate the ancient shadows. Martin Blackwood had always considered himself a practical man, the kind who understood that business was business and sentiment had no place in it. On the morning everything began to change, he sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor, barely registering the city sprawled below, through floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost more than most people made in a year. The letter on his desk was written on cheap paper, the kind that came in bulk from discount stores. The handwriting was shaky but determined, each word pressed deep into the page as if weighted with purpose. Martin had read it 3 times already, though he didn't need to. He remembered perfectly well the promise he'd made to old Gerald Winters 6 months ago. "Please," the letter read, "I know times are hard, but my daughter needs that operation. You gave me your word that if I signed over the property, you'd ensure she got the best care. I trusted you, Mr. Blackwood. I trusted your handshake." Martin crumpled the paper and tossed it into his pristine wastepaper basket. The property in question, 10 acres of prime real estate that had been in the Winters family for generations, was already being developed into luxury condominiums. The old man's daughter would have to make do with the public hospital like everyone else. A handshake wasn't a contract after all, and Martin hadn't gotten where he was by honoring informal agreements that cut into his profit margins. That evening, driving home in his Mercedes, Martin noticed the first sign that something was amiss. The car's perfectly tuned engine began to sputter and die, just as Gerald's ancient pickup had done the day Martin first met him. He managed to coast to the shoulder of the road, cursing under his breath. When he called for a tow truck, his phone showed no signal, exactly what had happened to Gerald when he tried to call for help after his truck broke down. Martin spent 2 hours in the growing darkness before help arrived. By then, an unseasonable chill had crept into his bones, reminiscent of the way Gerald had shivered in his thin jacket that day, apologizing for the broken heater in his truck. The next morning, Martin awoke to find his home's heating system had failed. The repair company couldn't come for 3 days. He huddled in expensive sweaters, remembering Gerald's small house with its ancient furnace, the way the old man had apologized for the cold when Martin came to discuss the property deal. That was only the beginning. Over the next week, small misfortunes began to multiply like shadows at dusk. His dry cleaning was lost, just as Gerald's only good suit had been ruined at the cleaners before an important meeting. The coffee maker in Martin's kitchen leaked, flooding his imported tiles, just as Gerald's pipes had burst, damaging his modest linoleum floors. His grocery delivery was missed, leaving him without food for dinner, just as Gerald had admitted to skipping meals to save money for his daughter's medical bills. Martin tried to ignore the pattern, but it became impossible when his bank called. There had been an error with his accounts. They were frozen, pending investigation, just as Gerald's modest savings had been tied up in red tape when he needed it the most. The coincidences were no longer coincidences. They had become a mirror, reflecting back every hardship Gerald had endured during the months leading up to their deal. Martin began to see the old man's face in unexpected places. In the foggy bathroom mirror after his shower stopped working. In the window reflection of his office, where the climate control now fluctuated wildly. In the dark screen of his phone when it died without warning. He tried to call Gerald, but the number was disconnected. When he drove out to the old property, now a construction site, none of the workers knew anything about the previous owner. The local coffee shop where they'd first discussed the deal had no recollection of the old man who used to come in for the cheapest cup of coffee, nursing it for hours in a corner booth. It was as if Gerald Winters had never existed, but the echoes of his suffering continued to ripple through Martin's life with methodical precision. The worst came when Martin developed a persistent cough. At first, he dismissed it as stress or the malfunctioning air conditioning, but it grew worse, accompanied by a tight chest and difficulty breathing. The doctor's expression was grave during the examination, just as it had been when diagnosing Gerald's daughter with the condition that required expensive surgery. Martin sat in the sterile exam room, his designer shirt damp with nervous sweat, as the doctor explained that he needed specialized treatment, expensive treatment, that would require multiple authorizations from his insurance company, which was already giving him trouble over routine claims, just as Gerald's insurance had done. That night, unable to sleep, Martin paced his darkened apartment. The city lights flickered beyond his windows like judging eyes. In every shadow, he imagined he could see Gerald's weathered face, patient and sad. The old man had never raised his voice, never made threats or demands. He had simply trusted in a handshake and a promise. The next morning, Martin's reflection in the mirror showed dark circles under his eyes and a sickly pallor to his skin. His expensive suit hung loose. He'd lost weight without noticing, just as Gerald had grown gaunt with worry over his daughter. The mail brought a final notice from his insurance company. His premium payment had somehow been lost, and his coverage would lapse in 3 days. Martin's hands shook as he read the letter, remembering Gerald's quiet dignity as he'd explained his own insurance troubles. In his office, Martin found himself opening drawer after drawer, searching for something he couldn't name. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of files, he found the crumpled letter he'd thrown away weeks ago. The cheap paper had aged quickly, turning yellow at the edges like old bones. He smoothed it out on his desk, reading Gerald's careful words again. The handwriting seemed to shift as he watched, the letters bleeding into dark pools that spelled out new messages. A promise is a promise. What goes around comes around. How does it feel? Martin grabbed his phone, fingers trembling as he dialed the hospital where Gerald had wanted to send his daughter. The receptionist had no record of any Winters family. The real estate office that had handled the property transfer had no documentation of the previous owner. The bank that had held Gerald's mortgage had no history of his account. But Martin's own life continued to unravel in perfect symmetry with the hardships Gerald had faced. Each day brought a new reflection of the old man's suffering, each night filled with dreams of weathered hands and trusting eyes. Finally, on a cold morning when his breath fogged in his unheated apartment, Martin found himself driving to the construction site where Gerald's house had once stood. The property was abandoned, building materials scattered like bones across the empty lot. The luxury condominiums had never materialized. The development company had gone bankrupt, just as Gerald had when medical bills consumed his savings. Martin stood in the empty lot, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud, and called out Gerald's name. His voice echoed off the skeletal foundations, coming back to him distorted and strange. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of decay and broken promises. A piece of paper skittered across the ground, catching on his shoe. It was Gerald's letter, though Martin had left it on his desk. The words had changed again, now reading simply, "A promise is forever." That night, Martin's phone rang just before midnight. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway, desperate for any connection to the world that seemed to be dissolving around him. "Hello, Mr. Blackwood," said Gerald's voice, as calm and gentle as ever. "I just wanted to check how you're doing. It's hard, isn't it, when everything you count on starts to slip away?" Martin tried to respond, but his chest seized with another coughing fit. When he could breathe again, the line was dead. His phone screen showed no record of the call. In the darkness of his bedroom, Martin finally understood. Every hardship, every setback, every moment of fear and uncertainty that Gerald had endured was being visited upon him with perfect precision. And somewhere, in a reality that seemed to have been erased from everyone's memory but his own, Gerald Winters was waiting patiently for the ledger to be balanced. Martin's cough grew worse, his insurance lapsed, his savings disappeared into a bureaucratic void. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his reflection showed more of Gerald's face each day. And still, the letter appeared every morning on his desk, no matter how many times he destroyed it. "A promise is forever," it always read now. "And we have all the time in the world." In his more lucid moments, Martin wondered if Gerald had known what would happen when he trusted in that handshake. If the old man's quiet dignity had masked something older and darker, something that understood the true weight of broken promises and the perfect symmetry of justice. But mostly, Martin simply waited, counting down the days until every misfortune he had dismissed in Gerald's life had been visited upon his own. And in the darkness of each night, he imagined he could hear the soft shuffle of Gerald's footsteps, pacing out the measure of time it would take for all accounts to be settled. After all, a promise is forever, and some debts can only be paid in kind. The first thing that struck me wrong about the widow's grace wasn't the impossible stillness of the water around her hull, or even the way our instruments went haywire as we approached. It was the smell. Ships lost at sea develop a particular stench: rot, rust, and brine mixed with diesel. But this vessel smelled of gardenias and fresh-cut grass, the kind of scent that has no business existing 50 nautical miles from shore, much less emanating from a derelict that had been missing for half a century. "Tell me you smell that," I said to Martinez, our salvage expert. She just nodded, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she gripped the railings of our approach vessel. The Grace loomed before us, 40,000 tons of pristine white steel that shouldn't exist. Her paint gleamed as if it had been applied yesterday, not a speck of rust or algae marking her hull. The morning fog clung to her like a shroud, but even through the haze, I could make out the Art Deco flourishes along her sides, the elegant sweep of her lines. She was beautiful in the way that certain predators are beautiful, a perfect killing machine disguised as luxury. "Registry confirms it's her," Jen called from the bridge. "The Widow's Grace, launched 1973, disappeared February 14th, 1974. But this is impossible. Look at her. She's brand new." I'd spent 20 years in maritime salvage, seen every kind of nautical horror show imaginable, but nothing prepared me for this. The Grace had vanished with 487 souls aboard, becoming one of those maritime mysteries that spawned 1,000 theories. Now here she was, as pristine as the day she launched, waiting for us like a perfectly preserved corpse. Oh, we should have turned back then. Should have radioed for backup, called in the authorities, done anything except what we did. But salvage rights mean everything in our business, and this find would set us up for life. 5 of us, me, Martinez, Jen, Dr. Wallace, our marine archaeologist, and Patel, our engineer, all thinking about early retirement, all about to learn exactly what retirement means to the Grace. The boarding went smoothly, too smoothly. No signs of forced entry. The boarding ladder descended for us as if operated by an invisible crew. The main deck was immaculate, teak gleaming with fresh varnish, deck chairs arranged precisely, white cushions unstained by time or weather. A newspaper lay folded on one of the tables, and I reached for it with trembling fingers. Today's date, not 1974. Today. "Captain," Martinez called, her voice tight with tension. "The bridge!" "You need to see this." The bridge was fully powered, every light burning, every screen active. Modern digital displays that couldn't possibly exist in 1974 showed our position, depth, weather conditions. The ship's log lay open on the captain's desk, the last entry in precise handwriting. February 14th, 1974, 23:47. Position 25 degrees north, 71 degrees west. All is well. The passengers are enjoying the Valentine's Day ball. Music from the Grand Salon carries beautifully through the ship. Sarah thought she saw something in the fog off the port bow, but scopes are clear. Must remember to send flowers to Rebecca for our anniversary when we dock. The ink looked wet. Check the Grand Salon, I ordered, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Full team, no one goes alone. The Grand Salon spanned the entire width of the ship on the main deck, a testament to 1970s opulence, updated with impossible modernity. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across a polished dance floor. Tables were set for dinner with fresh flowers and gleaming silverware. And music, faint, barely audible, but unmistakably present. Big band swinging, floating through hidden speakers. The flowers are fresh, Dr. Wallace said, touching a rose centerpiece. And look at this. She held up a smartphone, its screen still glowing with unread notifications. It belonged to someone named Rebecca. Martinez. I heard our Martinez inhale sharply. That's my daughter's name, but she's only 16. She doesn't have... The phone's wallpaper showed a young woman who could have been Martinez's twin at that age, standing on this very ship, wearing modern clothes. That's when the photographs started appearing. We found them scattered across tables, tucked into mirrors, sliding out of books. Hundreds of them, all showing people we knew in situations that had never happened. Chen with gray hair, teaching his unborn daughter to dance. Wallace accepting an award she'd never won. Patel at a wedding he'd never attended. All dated within the last year, all taken aboard this ship. The music grew louder, and with it came voices, snippets of conversation, laughter, the clink of glasses, the sounds of a party in full swing. But we stood in an empty room. "We need to leave," Patel said, backing toward the door. "Right now." That's when the first apparition appeared, a woman in an evening dress straight out of 1974, walking through the far wall as if it were mist. She turned to us, smiled, and I recognized her face from our research files. Sarah Whitman, first officer of the Grace when she vanished. Her mouth moved, but the words that came out were wrong. "Welcome home, Thomas," she said, using my name. "Your wife misses you terribly. She's waiting in your cabin. My wife had died 3 years ago." Patel broke first, running for the door. We heard his screams echo down the corridor, then silence. Chen went next, chasing shadows that called out in his dead mother's voice. Wallace simply stood transfixed as figures from her past research swirled around her, pulling her deeper into their dance. Martinez grabbed my arm. "The engine room. If this thing's alive, that's its heart." We ran, but the ship didn't make it easy. Corridors shifted, stairs led to impossible places. Every room we passed showed us memories we'd never made, futures we'd never live. My dead wife cooking breakfast in a galley that served hundreds. Martinez's daughter growing old in the span of photographs that lined a single hallway. The engine room door stood open, revealing not the massive diesel engines of 1974, but something else. Something that pulsed with blue-white light and twisted in geometries that hurt to look at. Not machinery, but tissue. As if we were standing in the beating heart of a living thing. "It's not a ship," Martinez whispered. "It never was." It's a collector," I finished. "It collects us, our stories, our might-have-beens. The thing in the engine room reached for us with tendrils of light and memory. I saw my whole life spiral out before me, not as it had been, but as it could be. All my regrets undone, all my losses reversed. So beautiful, so perfect. Martinez's hand found mine, warm and real, anchoring me to now. "Together," she said, pulling out the thermite charges we'd brought for emergency hull breaching. "We end this together." The explosion was beautiful. The ship screamed, not with sound, but with time itself. Reality twisted, fractured, reformed. As consciousness faded, I saw the truth in the thing's dying moments. We were its last victims, but also its first. We would become the story that started it all, the legend that would draw others to it across decades. I woke up on a rescue vessel, Martinez beside me. We were the only survivors. The Grace was gone, sinking into waters that had become mundane again. The medic checking my vitals wore a uniform I didn't recognize, used equipment I had never seen. "You're lucky," she said. "When we got the distress call from 1974, we didn't think we'd find anyone alive." Martinez gripped my hand. Through the porthole, I watched the last bubbles rise from where the Grace had been. In 50 years, she would rise again, pristine and perfect, waiting for 5 salvage experts who thought they'd found the opportunity of a lifetime. I checked my phone. No signal, of course, but the date was clear. February 15th, 1974. Somewhere in Miami, my father was celebrating his 10th birthday. In Peru, Martinez's mother was just learning to walk. And in a shipyard in Newport News, workers were laying the keel of a new luxury liner, their dreams and ambitions feeding the thing that would become the Widow's Grace. The rescue ship's radio crackled with voices speaking in a language I almost understood. As we headed to port, I thought I caught the scent of gardenias on the wind. Detective Marcus Thorne stood motionless in the moonlit study, his cold gray eyes fixed on the corpse sprawled across the antique Persian rug. The victim's final expression was one of absolute terror, fitting, given what Thorne had witnessed him do just 3 days prior through careful surveillance. "Fascinating," he murmured, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a gloved hand. The fear response in the final moments caused significant pupil dilation. The adrenal glands must have been working overtime. The detective's clinical observation belied the satisfaction churning beneath his composed exterior. Theodore Maxwell, respected philanthropist and secret murderer of 6 homeless women, had finally faced justice. Thorne's justice. The empty syringe on the floor contained a particularly nasty cocktail that replicated the effects of the poison Maxwell had used on his own victims. Poetry, really. Thorne meticulously checked his handiwork, ensuring everything appeared exactly as planned. The scene would read as a simple cardiac event to the average investigator. Only someone with his level of perception would notice the nearly microscopic injection site behind Maxwell's ear, or the faint traces of struggle masked by the natural disarray of a man collapsing in distress. But then, there was no one else quite like Marcus Thorne. He had discovered his gift for observation as a child, noticing tiny details others missed. The slight discoloration on his mother's neck that preceded her diagnosis of thyroid cancer, the imperceptible tremor in his father's hand that signaled early Parkinson's. By the time he joined the police force at 22, his abilities had developed into something extraordinary. Yet the system had failed him time and again. He watched monsters walk free on technicalities, watched grieving families denied closure by clever lawyers and corrupted evidence. The final straw came 5 years ago, when the Winchester butcherer walked free despite Thorne's meticulous case against him. 3 weeks later, another family was found carved up in their beds. That night, sitting in his darkened apartment surrounded by case files and crime scene photos, Thorne made a decision. If the system couldn't deliver justice, he would become justice itself. He began slowly, carefully. Each target was researched exhaustively, their guilt confirmed beyond any doubt through weeks of surveillance and investigation. His methods were precise, customized, each death an ironic reflection of the killer's own crimes. A drowner drowned in his own bathtub, the strangler found with ligature marks matching those of his victims. Poetry, all of it. Thorne moved through Maxwell's study with practiced efficiency, checking for any trace of his presence. His gloves were medical grade, his shoes covered in disposable booties, his clothes selected to shed minimal fibers. The syringe would dissolve completely within hours, leaving only natural compounds found in any human body. He paused at Maxwell's desk, drawn to a framed photograph. Maxwell stood beaming beside a group of homeless women outside one of his shelters, including 3 he would later murder. The detective's lip curled slightly. Such audacity deserved a special kind of punishment. A sound from downstairs froze him in place. Footsteps, multiple sets, far too early for the body to be discovered. Thorne moved silently to the study door, his mind racing through possibilities. Maxwell lived alone. His housekeeper wasn't due until morning. No deliveries were scheduled. He'd checked the records thoroughly. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft crackle of radio static. "Police!" A familiar voice commanded from down the hall. "Check upstairs." "Chen," his partner. Thorne's pulse quickened, but his expression remained neutral. This was an unexpected variable, but variables could be managed. He'd prepared for such contingencies. He glanced at his watch. The dissolving syringe needed another 30 minutes to completely break down. He needed to buy time. Moving with fluid grace, Thorne slipped into the hall bathroom adjacent to the study. Seconds later, heavy footsteps approached. "Clear," a voice called from down the hall. "Check that bathroom," Chen ordered. Thorne withdrew his badge as the door opened, appearing appropriately startled. "Sarah? What's going on?" His partner's eyes widened. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "Anonymous tip about Maxwell," he replied smoothly. "Caller suggested he might be in danger. I was closest to the scene and decided to check it out." He gestured toward the study. "We should probably look in there." Chen's dark eyes studied him for a moment. Something in her expression made him uneasy. "That's funny," she said quietly, "because I never radioed in that we were here." Thorne's mask didn't slip, but his mind raced. She was right. He'd heard radio static, but no actual transmission. A rookie mistake. "Marcus," Chen continued, her hand moving slowly toward her weapon. "This isn't the first scene where you've shown up unexpectedly. I started tracking patterns after the 3rd time, started looking deeper into your casework, into the deaths of suspects you'd investigated." "Sarah," he said calmly, "you're letting paranoia cloud your judgment. Maxwell needs to be checked on. He could be in danger." "He's already dead, isn't he?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Just like the others. You're not here to save him. You're here cleaning up." For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dimly lit hallway. Partners for 3 years, friends, or so he'd thought. But she could never understand what he'd become, what he had to do. "Tell me I'm wrong," she pleaded. Thorne sighed softly. "You really are an excellent detective, Sarah. I've always admired that about you." Her hand jerked toward her holster, but Thorne was faster. The tiny needle in his sleeve found her neck with practiced precision. Her eyes widened in shock, then confusion as her muscles began to fail. "A modified version of Maxwell's formula," he explained as he caught her sagging form. "Don't worry. Unlike his victims, you'll wake up in about 6 hours with a headache and no memory of the last few minutes, a common side effect of extreme stress and trauma." He carefully arranged her unconscious form in the hallway, placing her gun within reach. To anyone else, it would appear she'd suffered a sudden anxiety attack while clearing the house. By the time she woke up, Maxwell's death would be attributed to natural causes, and any suspicions she had would seem like stress-induced paranoia. Poetry. But as Thorne staged the scene, a new thought nagged at him. Chen was brilliant. She pieced together a pattern everyone else had missed. Even if she didn't remember this encounter, she might eventually reach the same conclusions again. He looked down at his partner's peaceful face, considering options he'd never wanted to contemplate. She was innocent. More than that, she was genuinely good. She didn't deserve to join his growing collection of necessary sacrifices. For the first time in 5 years, Marcus Thorne felt uncertainty creep into his calculated world. Justice had seemed so clear before, a simple matter of identifying those who deserved punishment and delivering it with scientific precision. But now the lines were blurring. Where did justice end and mere survival begin? He touched the secondary syringe in his pocket, the one that delivered a more permanent solution. It would be easier, safer. A tragic case of 2 partners ambushed while investigating a tip. One dead, one wounded. No one would question it. Logical, clean, necessary. His fingers closed around the syringe. "Poetry," he whispered, but the word had lost its savor. In the distance, sirens began to wail. I first met Miss Agatha Stillwell on a bitter November afternoon, when the skeletal branches of maple trees scratched against the slate-gray sky like desperate fingers. As a private detective in our small New England town, I had grown accustomed to unusual cases, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited behind the heavy oak door of 17 Sycamore Street. The house itself seemed to resist visitors. Its Victorian architecture, once grand, had deteriorated into a state of elegant decay. Dead leaves gathered in drifts against the foundation, and thick curtains blocked every window. Even the brass knocker, when I reached for it, felt unnaturally cold against my knuckles. Miss Stillwell answered on the 3rd knock. She was a tall, thin woman, with pale skin and dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her black dress seemed to belong to another century entirely. But it was her eyes that caught my attention. Wide, fearful things that darted constantly to the shadows behind her. "Mr. Harrison." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, come in quickly. She doesn't like the door being open too long." I stepped into a foyer that smelled of dust and lavender, and something else, something sharp and acrid that I couldn't quite place. "She?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Miss Stillwell's sister had contacted me about the situation, worried about her siblings' increasing isolation and strange behavior. "Cassandra," Miss Stillwell replied, wringing her hands. My cat." As if summoned by her name, a massive, black cat appeared at the top of the stairs. I've never seen an animal move with such deliberate purpose. Its yellow eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. The cat was easily twice the size of any domestic feline I'd encountered, with glossy fur that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the heavy curtains. "She came to me 3 years ago," Miss Stillwell explained as she led me into a sitting room. Every surface was immaculate, despite the house's external decay. On the night of my dear mother's funeral, I found her sitting on Mother's favorite chair, and she spoke to me. I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse quickened. "Spoke to you?" "Oh, yes," Miss Stillwell said, sinking into an antique armchair. "She told me she would take care of me, just as Mother had." "And she has, Mr. Harrison? She has." The cat, Cassandra, slinked into the room and leaped onto Miss Stillwell's lap. The woman's hands immediately began stroking its fur, though I noticed her fingers trembled slightly. The cat's purr filled the room, a sound too deep and resonant to be natural. "At first it was little things," Stillwell continued. "She would warn me about spoiled food before I could eat it. She would tell me which visitors had ill intentions. But then, she swallowed hard. Then she began to insist that I needed no one else, that the world outside was dangerous, that she alone could protect me." Cassandra's yellow eyes never left my face as Miss Stillwell spoke. There was something obscene about the way the cat's tail wrapped around the woman's wrist, like a manacle. "And now," I prompted gently, "now I cannot leave." Tears welled in Miss Stillwell's eyes. She shows me things, terrible things that will happen if I disobey. And when I sleep, I dream her dreams of hunting, of power, of ancient rites performed in moonless groves. Please, Mr. Harrison, you must." The cat's head snapped toward her, and Miss Stillwell fell silent so quickly it was as if her voice had been physically stolen. Cassandra's purr transformed into a low growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Miss Stillwell," I said carefully, reaching into my coat pocket where I kept a small pouch of herbs, a precaution I'd started carrying after my last supernatural case. "I believe I can help you, but you must trust me completely." The temperature in the room plummeted. Cassandra rose on Miss Stillwell's lap, her fur bristling, until she seemed twice her already considerable size. When she spoke, her voice was like silk over steel. "The detective is leaving now," the cat said. "Aren't you, Mr. Harrison?" The words slithered into my mind like smoke, bringing with them visions of my own violent death. My body found weeks later, partially consumed, ruled as a tragic accident involving feral animals. I gripped the herb pouch tighter, my other hand moving to the silver cross I wore beneath my shirt. "No," I said, forcing the strength into my voice. "I'm not." What happened next occurred with frightening speed. Cassandra launched herself from Miss Stillwell's lap with a shriek that shattered every window in the room. Her form seemed to blur and expand, black fur becoming black smoke, yellow eyes multiplying until they filled the darkness that now swirled around us. I threw the herb pouch, a mixture of rowan berries, St. John's wort, and blessed thistle, directly into the maelstrom. The effect was instantaneous. The darkness recoiled with a sound like burning flesh, and in that moment I saw the witch's true form, ancient, terrible, and hungry. "Eleanor," I shouted. "The circle, now." Miss Stillwell, to her eternal credit, didn't hesitate. While I had been talking, I'd carefully scattered salt in a thin line around her chair. Now she closed the circle with a sweep of her foot, just as the Cassandra thing recovered and lunged for her. The barrier flared with white light. The witch cat crashed against it with a howl of fury, her form rippling between feline and something far older and more horrible. I began the banishment ritual, words of Latin and Hebrew that I'd memorized but never thought I'd need to use. "He cannot save you," Cassandra hissed at Miss Stillwell. "You are mine. You have always, always been mine. Your mother gave you to me with her dying breath." "No," Miss Stillwell said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it yet. "She didn't. I gave myself to you out of grief and fear, and now I take that gift back." The witch's scream of rage rattled the foundations of the house. Pictures fell from walls, furniture toppled, but Miss Stillwell stood firm, and I continued the ritual, even as blood began to trickle from my nose and ears. In the end, it wasn't the herbs or the ritual that banished the witch. It was Miss Stillwell herself, standing up within the salt circle and saying, simply and firmly, "Get out of my house." The explosion of darkness nearly knocked me unconscious. When my vision cleared, the room was filled with normal late afternoon sunlight streaming through the broken windows. Miss Stillwell stood in her salt circle, breathing heavily but straight-backed and clear-eyed. Where Cassandra had been, there was only a small pile of black fur that dissolved into ash when the breeze touched it. The aftermath was quieter than you might expect. We swept up the broken glass and the salt. Miss Stillwell made tea in china cups that had somehow survived unscathed. We didn't talk much about what had happened. Sometimes the most supernatural events are best processed in silence. Before I left, Miss Stillwell pressed a cameo brooch into my hand. "It was my mother's," she said. "A real protection this time. I still keep it in my desk drawer, next to my case notes and a small pouch of herbs. Sometimes on late nights when I'm working, I think I hear a distant purring, but when I touch the cameo, it always fades away." Miss Stillwell still lives in that house on Sycamore Street, though she's had it renovated now. She hosts a book club every Wednesday afternoon. She's planted roses in the front garden, and she never, ever takes in stray cats. I drive by sometimes, just to check on things. The house looks cheerful these days, with warm light spilling from uncurtained windows. But occasionally, just as dusk is falling, I could swear I see a large black shape watching from the shadows of the maple trees. I keep the herb pouch well stocked, just in case. In our line of work, you never know when you might need to save someone from their familiar spirits, or from their own loneliness, which sometimes amounts to the same thing.